Good evening. It seems a little incongruous, to say the least, to come from a conference about happiness, and indeed to come from a dinner in which the president has returned to the stage with his fellow comedians and have a conversation about the Holocaust and the Gulag, humanity's dark side. The only thing I can say to justify this incongruity is that this is the antithesis of happiness. It is, I think, hard to imagine more extreme human misery and suffering than occurred in this part of the world in the 1930s and in the 1940s. And I'm extremely excited to be joined on this stage by two of the world's most influential and most talented writers who have tackled this extraordinarily difficult subject. Ann Epplbaum, known, I suppose, to some for her journalism, but I think increasingly better known for her books. Gulag, which came out in 2003, won a Pulitzer Prize, is a brilliant account of the Soviet prison camp system. But you should also read Iron Curtain, her brilliant book about the imposition of communism on Eastern Europe after the war. And of course, everybody in this country knows, I'm sure, her book Red Famine, Stalin's War on the Ukraine, which won the Lionel Gerber Prize last year. Full disclosure, Anne and I have known one another for so long that we won't get into the details. Whereas by contrast, my other guest is someone I only just met, Jonathan Lіттелл, but someone I've wanted to meet for some time. Like Anne, he is a Yale-educated writer, but unlike Anne, he's classified as an author of fiction, as a novelist, and as a Franco-American, his first, his most famous novel, I should say, The Kindly Ones, is, I think, widely regarded as one of the most impressive literary realizations of World War II and the Holocaust ever published. It won all the big French literary prizes, the Prix Goncourt, the Prix de l'Académie Française, and it is a riveting work. I am going to lead this conversation, and I thought that the best way to start would be to ask each of them to reflect on their different methodologies, because, to put it crudely, in publishing terms, I have non-fiction on one side and fiction on the other, history on one side and literature on the other. And yet, in practice, when one writes on this or any subject, an imaginative leap is required, an imaginative leap into the most horrific circumstances imaginable. So, Anne, let me begin with you. I want to talk not so much about what happened as about how you were able to write about it and what problems, if any, you faced in writing about the horrific events that you describe in all three of the books I've mentioned. That would be a good starting point for me.
Well, first of all, thank you, Neil, for framing this so elegantly. I too was wondering how we were going to get from happiness to unhappiness without stopping anywhere in the middle, but I guess there was maybe the hallway in between. So the only thing I can say, I first encountered this exact problem you describe, which is how to imagine a horrific circumstance that I myself don't remember. In other words, obviously when I started thinking about the Gulag, this was my first history book, and working on it, I had read many of the great memoirists. Obviously I read Solzhenitsyn, I read Yevgeny Ginsberg, I read the survivors, then I began branching out. I read really a wide range of, even actually before I did any historical research, I read people describing what had happened to them. And one of the things I realized was that because I am not a survivor, and it was not my story, that the way in which I was going to be able to tell it was I was going to have to use as many of their voices as possible. And so when I wrote Gulag, and then actually again when I wrote Red Famine, my book about Ukraine, every opportunity I had to put the situation in someone else's voice, I tried to do that. I mean, you almost need a kind of humility. Okay, I don't remember this, I wasn't there. I can sketch out the frame of it, I can give you the dates, and I can locate it in time, and I can explain, or I can try to begin to explain how it happened, but I can't tell you the experience of it. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about whose voices to use, how to find them, how to use it. And so if you read any of my books, you'll find quite a lot of individual stories. And I reckoned that the way to be most fair to the history was to use as big a range of stories as possible. And so I always tried, to the extent that I could, there's a very, very limited number, for example, of Gulag prisoners' memoirs. There's one or two, but not much. Although you can get some of their point of view from the archives. I tried to show a range of views and have a range of voices, so that the story was described from different angles, and that was the way to make it most fair to the circumstances. I mean, I found that as I was writing it, I had to be almost clinical and you have to be incredibly chilly. Almost, I would be very interested to hear how Jonathan dealt with this, because my attitude was, okay, I have to back myself away from how I feel about this story, and I have to, create this mosaic using people's voices, and this isn't my story, and I'm not allowed to start crying while I'm writing it. So it is, they are the ones who are important. I'm showcasing them. And this is not about my emotions or how I feel about it. And so I would sit in my room and I would look out the window and it would be a nice day, and I would, try and be absolutely as cold as possible, saying, no, this story works in this paragraph and this one doesn't work in another. And I really did try. I mean, occasionally I found, both actually when writing Gulag and then later when writing Iron Curtain, I did have nightmares about some of the things that I was reading. But while I was working, I always, tried not to become too involved.
Well, just imagine that's heavy artillery falling on our bunker, shall we? I'm sure it will subside in a moment. Even the heaviest bombardment stops. I can completely relate to that. Shh. Don't you know there's a war on? Because part of what the historian does is seek the quotations that can tell the story. Seek the documents, whether it's diaries or letters, that allow you to get the reader into the first-hand experience as far as it's been documented. And as historian, part of your task is just to construct a scrapbook with an intelligible narrative. I have a question for you before I turn to Jonathan, which is, how did you feel that you conveyed the perpetrator's thinking? Because I sense that somehow to articulate the experience of the victims is more straightforward, if harrowing, than to convey the thinking of the perpetrators. Did you struggle with that?
I did struggle with it. I mean, in all of my books, I spent, there's a chapter in the Gulag book on the guards, and there's this long section in the Ukraine book about the perpetrators of the famine. Who were they? How do you get into their minds as well? And I did seek their memoirs, and I did seek what they had written. They, of course, wrote the archives. So I have, from their point of view, in both of those circumstances, as well as in the other books, I have their version of what was happening. And very often, of course, since we're talking about the Soviet Union, it was kind of couched in ideological language. So there would be a Marxist explanation for why we need to make this or that decision. And actually, one of the conclusions I came to was that Marxism was very important for them because it was the thing that justified what they were doing. So it actually wasn't fake. It was real. It was an important piece of what enabled them to do what they did. I spent a lot of time thinking about them. What was their motive? What was the structure that enabled them? What kind of jobs were they doing? When you write about Gulag guards, for example, lots of them were very unhappy. These were bad jobs. This wasn't something somebody chose to do. Many of them had a kind of, they were being punished by being sent to Siberia just as much as the prisoners were. So I tried to write about how they would have seen it at the time. But of course it's harder than writing about the victims, not least because they wrote less.
Okay, Jonathan, I got a confession to make. I was a failed novelist once. I attempted to write fiction.
We are all failed novelists.
Maybe everybody here is a failed novelist, and only a very few succeed. But I tried to write fiction and ultimately gave it up because I simply could not feel comfortable in imagined heads. I wanted to be in real heads, essentially doing an archaeology of lived experience with the documents that survive. So when I picked up The Kindly Ones and I realized that you had essentially put yourself in the head of an imaginary SS officer, my first reaction was, don't do this, please don't do this, you should not go there. So help me understand your motive and your method.
Complicated question. Well, I was very interested by what you said because in a way my book is practically diametrically opposed to yours. I mean, you focus on victims, I focus on perpetrators. You have a polyphonic book. Mine is completely monovocal, if we can call it that. And so for me, obviously, it's a very personal experience. I mean, there are many elements. I mean, for instance, I grew up during the Vietnam War, which was very present in my household when I was a small child. And I distinctly remember as a very small boy, 5, 6, being absolutely terrorized at the idea that when I reached 18, I would be drafted and sent to Vietnam. Obviously, I had no sense of time. I didn't realize what that meant in terms of time, but it was a constant question to my parents, like, when I turn 18, what's going to happen? Am I going to go to Vietnam and kill people? So unlike my father, who grew up as a child during World War II in a very safe place in America as a Jew, who always imaginatively projected himself as a potential victim, I, from a very early age, imaginally projected myself as a perpetrator because my biggest fear was being sent to Vietnam. I wasn't afraid of being shot, I was afraid of having to kill people, of being forced to perpetrate violence in that way. And my father would very nicely answer, don't worry, if it's still going on when you're 18, we'll send you to Sweden and everything will be fine. So, okay. And then the vagaries of life were such that when I was about 26, I started working humanitarian aid. I started with Bosnia for about 2 years. Then I did Chechnya, Afghanistan, and back several other countries, and back to Chechnya. So I had quite a long 7-year experience of conflicts. And the interesting thing when you're doing humanitarian aid, as opposed to journalism, first of all, you stay there for the duration. It's a very long time in war, which is a very different experience. I also worked as a journalist much later. But journalists, you go in, you spend a couple of very intense weeks, very dangerous weeks, and then you go out. Humanitarian aid, you live there. So, you know, Boston, I stayed there for 2 years. It was just like not endless, the 2/3 of the war. And as part of my work, obviously on a pretty much daily basis, I was dealing with perpetrators because that's the people who you negotiate with. It's the people who are your business interlocutors for access. So in Sarajevo, I was dealing with Serbs. In Chechnya, I was dealing with Russians and also rebels and so forth and so forth. And you're always talking to these people, again, in a very different way that journalists talk to them. I have had the occasion several times of being in meetings together with journalists, with guys I knew. And with journalists, they're completely different. With journalists, they're like representing themselves. They're playing a role of who they imagine themselves to be. With us, it's just business. It's just like, when do you want to go through? Are we going to let you through? It's like totally like just stupid, basic discussions about access, about quantities, about money, about whatever. So you get to know them in this very kind of daily, ordinary, normal way, sometimes over long periods of time. And so I had this kind of experience of daily functioning with these kind of people. Sometimes, you know, fairly important ones, generals, colonels, whatever, in different situations. And I guess all this kind of, you know, when I started this project, it all just kind of came together and I modelized it. Then, of course, there was another level, which is I wanted to avoid, my counter model was always the Visconti film, The Damned, which I felt was just far too psychosexual, personal in interpretation. I wanted to stay very close to the actual facts. I decided I had to avoid this kind of what I considered an error, although now I've come back to it, but it's a different thing. So, you know, massive research, very grounded in the history, but still, when it comes to actually writing it, it's just projecting yourself from your own experience into what I, as a young, naive, idealistic guy, would have been if I'd grown up in Germany in the 20s and 30s and put all that idealism and all that enthusiasm at the service of something that turned out to be an extremely flawed idea, but which, at least my narrator, when he starts, doesn't realize. I mean, he's quite enthusiastic about it. He's a true believer. And so I just tried to modelize it in that way, drawing on all sorts of stuff and also drawing on all my literary reading and all my historical reading and whatever, and because it's literature, you know, I don't care. I just steal stuff everywhere. I'm sort of a literary baby of William Burroughs, so I'm absolutely not afraid to steal anything that I like. So I just, you know, anything that looked good, I grabbed it and I just put it in. So the book is a whole mix. It's my own experience. It's the historical record. It's literary memories. It's dreams. It's everything. I don't really make a distinction between those levels of reality. I think they're all equally valid. Things people told me, stories that I transposed. A lot of stuff comes from my own stories or stories that people told me from my period, the 90s, in completely different conflicts. I would take African stories and transpose them. I would work in this way. A lot of the Nazi meetings, obviously, I spent, fucking years of my life in UN coordination meetings. And a lot of my Nazi meetings all my friends laugh. They're like, John, it's a fucking UN meeting. You know, like, yeah, it is a UN meeting. I even used software that we use for calculating rations for people in the fields, you know, for when we create rations for feeding people. I used that same software to calculate the rations for Auschwitz. So I ran through the rations I could find in the historical record to get the calculations for protein, lipids, glucids, calories, and so forth. So it's an imaginative projection. Whether it works or doesn't work, it's not for me to say. But that's what I set out to do, and I did it, and I don't have a problem with that.
Let me turn back to Anne and ask a question I often ask myself. Dare historians read historical novels?
It's risky.
Why?
Well, I mean, I do read historical novels, as I'm sure you do too, so I don't
No, I gave up.
Really?
I gave up.
Really?
I haven't read his book because you can't in your brain maintain a partition between historical evidence that is authentic and the imagined narrative of a novel.
But I often read, so whenever I'm writing a book, I spend a lot of time looking for and reading novels about that period. I mean, how people imagined themselves in a particular moment. And then even to some degree, how people later on imagined what had happened is really important. I mean, the novels of the Gulag, for example, are hugely important if you want to understand what happened in the Gulag. So Shalamov is a famous Gulag novelist. Whether what happened in his books really happened exactly as he said it, or whether he was exaggerating, or we don't really know. But the essence of what he writes, and the feelings that he's describing are very, very useful for explaining how people felt when they were inside a camp. I mean, if you want to get inside the heads of people, how it looked to them at the time, then actually, yeah, it's really, really useful to have someone imagine it.
The rule I came up with was you could read novels by people who'd been there, but not by people who hadn't. So this hit me when I was researching a book called The Pity of War about World War I, and I'd read Siegfried Sassoon, and I'd read the poems of Owen, and I'd read a lot of literature. But I was also reading Pat Barker's Ghost Road trilogy, written long after the fact by a woman who clearly had not been anywhere near the Western Front. And I stopped reading the trilogy because I realized it was contaminating my understanding of the men in the trenches, because her sensibility was that of the late 20th century. And you could tell. And it was as I was reading those novels that I decided I've got to stop reading this stuff because it's kind of contaminating my understanding of the contemporary experience. And it kind of makes me feel uneasy. I started dipping into your novel today and thinking, God, this is so readable. Do I keep going, or do I stick to my rule of no historical fiction unless by contemporaries? Because in some ways, the way to read your book is not as a book about the Holocaust at all. It's a book about the experience of your generation of Americans grappling with questions of violence inspired by Vietnam through Bosnia. And then I kind of can read it. I kind of can read it as a novel about that generation. I'm not sure I dare read it as a novel about the Holocaust.
For me, it's just a case study. I don't have any particular special interest in the Holocaust as opposed to every other type of violence. I've worked in, dozens of wars.
So that gets me to a question.
For me, it's just a case study.
Is it all the same? Are all genocides fundamentally the same?
Well, there's a beautiful sentence by Marguerite Yourcenar at the beginning of a very short book she wrote about the Freikorps War in Lithuania around 1919, 1920, when she's like, toutes les guerres sont comme les pommes de terre et le seigle, elles ont un goût local. So wars are like potatoes and rye, they have a local taste. And when you go to a lot of wars, of course, each war has a very local taste. Syria is very different from South Sudan, for example. But if you function analytically and you look at mechanisms, then it gets much simpler. Because the mechanisms, although I would say the contents differ, like for instance, if we're talking contents, let's say Nuer and Dinka tribal conflict in South Sudan is obviously completely different from Chechens and Russian in Chechnya, for example. But still, those are just contents, what people put into the reason that they think they're fighting for. The actual basic processes of violence are the same. And what interests me is violence, fundamentally. So in that sense, I don't have a hang-up about, I'm not using this in a negative way, but I'm just saying for me, the problem you're posing about sticking to the historical record and is not a problem for me because I'm not a historian and I'm not trying to do historical research. I've written nonfiction books about situations I've been to, like Syria and Chechnya. Fine. And I've written novels. But the thing I'm looking for is the same thing, which is what is the nature of violence in terms of those who perpetrate it? That's the question I'm interested in. And so the Nazis, for me, were just a way to go as far as possible into that question in a certain direction.
So for a historian of my vintage, it's really sort of strange to hear someone make that argument, because I was a graduate student in the days of the German Sonderweg and the Historikerzeit, when the uniqueness of the Holocaust was a central tenet of German academic life. And you got into deep trouble if you even went so far as to compare the Gulag with the concentration camps of the Third Reich.
Yeah, but that's a political question, not an analytical question.
Well, I wonder if that's right, because there does seem to me to be a simple scale question here that there's no getting away from. The sheer massive scale of both Stalin's and Hitler's crimes. And how do you think about this?
So I had this, obviously, I mean, this is one of the things I had to confront when writing the book. My book, Gulag, actually begins with a kind of with an introduction, and the introduction does various different things. One of the things it does is it begins by talking about why we in the West remember the crimes of communism and the crimes of Nazism so differently. What are the cultural reasons for that? What are the historical reasons? And then I also did something which I wasn't originally planning to do, which is I compare the Gulag camps and the Nazi camps, and I talk about why they were the same and why they were different. And one of the reasons I did that was because my publisher said, if you don't do that, then your reviewers will do it for you. So just do it before they do it. But actually, the process of doing that and thinking about it is, I actually agree very much with what you just said. The mental processes, the tendency of humans to move in a direction of mass murder, the things that trigger and instigate violence really are often very similar in different places and at different times. Although the structures and the politics can be very different and the culture can be very different. I mean, I would agree that, and there's one of the reasons why I think it's very interesting and worthy to compare these crimes, even if, I actually, this discussion of whether the Holocaust or the Gulag was worse, I really hate, because sooner or later people start counting numbers, and, it all depends who you were and where you were at which moment, whether it seemed better or worse to you, whether you were in West Ukraine or Eastern Poland or, Lithuania, and whether you were Jewish or an anti-communist, so I don't think that's a very interesting conversation, but I do think it's very interesting to compare them, because actually by comparing them you learn things about Stalin. When you think about Stalin and Hitler together, the things they have in common and the reasons why they're different also, I don't know, you understand the Gulag better if you say why it wasn't like the Nazis. I mean, for example, the Gulag did not have gas ovens, and there was not a mass killing system, because that wasn't the purpose of the Gulag. The Gulag was justified by the people who built it as a sort of, these are labor camps that are helping us build the Soviet Union and making it a great place. In other words, making it we're building the future by using these useless people, these enemies of the people. We're deploying their prison labor to make our society better. And understanding that, it's very important for how people justified it to themselves and to one another, and that's part of how the bureaucracy worked. And when you understand that, it's a kind of insight into Stalinism. Hitler's justification was quite different. So I think all these comparisons are useful and informative, and you learn things from them.
Jonathan, in the literature on the Holocaust,
I could actually bounce back on what
Go
Anne
ahead.
said, because I'm a big fan of the comparative method, but as a method. In other words, comparative method doesn't mean saying things are different or the same. It means looking at systems and functions and processes and trying to modelize one against the other to try to pull out. In psychoanalysis, for instance, there's a distinction which for me is super important at many levels, which is the distinction between processes and contents. And for me, everything which is in the nature of ideology is what they call contents. What's interesting for me is the processes, the underlying processes. I actually have a slight disagreement with you about what you said about the Gulag, because the Stalinist regime also perpetrated mass exterminations.
It did, but not in the camps.
Not in the camps, in a different way.
Yeah,
but
no, I know.
that's the nature of just content. That's just, they did it differently.
Yeah.
I, obviously, when I was working on my book, thought about this at great length, and the whole problem for me was asking the right question. It wasn't so much about the answers, about the right question. And the way I ended up formulating the question, which I think is, in my opinion, the right way to formulate it, is why if you look at the end of World War I, 1918, there aren't that many countries in the world, not like now. You know, I don't know how many exactly, but there are maybe 8 great powers and then another dozen actual countries, and everything else is colonies. So we're looking at a much smaller group of nations, of which the great majority, with a few exceptions like Spain and Portugal, actually participate in World War I. And so one way you can formulate the question is that why, after 1918, did certain societies feel it was right and justified to exterminate or imprison entire categories of people in the name of social good, and other societies felt, no, this is going a little bit too far? And if you look at the question that way, the answer is actually extremely simple. The societies that decided it was okay to do it are the societies that lost World War I, and I count Russia among the losers, because they got completely laminated in 1917 in the revolution and the Civil War. And Germany and Austria, I count also Austria among the perpetrators, and most of the personnel of the camps was actually, well, significantly higher percentage of the camp personnel was Austrian compared to the general population. So Austria is definitely heavily implicated. Whereas the French and the British, who committed horrendous colonial massacres at the time, horrendous. I mean, Amritsar is just one that's famous, but there were, massive killings in French and British colonies all through the 19th century and the early 20th century, including the French repression of the Rif revolt in 46 after World War II and so forth. Still, it was punctual. They would never go so far as to say, okay, this entire category of people has to be wiped out. So already you have the fact that certain societies are reasoning in terms of categories of people, and this is where they put different contents. The Germans analyze in terms of race, the Russians analyze in terms of class, but still, that they have the same notion of categories of people, where it doesn't matter what the individual biography of an individual within that category is, as long as he's part of that category, he is treated as a member of that category. And then they classify. Some need to be wiped out completely, some need to be wiped out partially, some need to be put to work for the greater good of society in horrendous conditions, and they modelize these demographics, and they reason demographically. There's actually, for instance, a fantastic German planning document for the invasion of the Soviet Union, created by civil servants and demographers in the Goering ministry, called the Green Book, in which they actually do very scientific analysis about land surface. The whole objective, their sort of fantasy vision of the post-war order would be that Soviet Union would be an agrarian colony creating a...
Ukraine in particular.
Ukraine in particular, more, yeah, of course, because of the Black Lands. Dégagé, they would be making a surplus agricultural for Germany. So they calculated how many people we need as slaves per square kilometer of land in order to feed them, but to generate a surplus, and very precise scientific calculations, and they arrived at a figure of we need to get rid of 35 million Soviets to achieve this objective. It's a scientific demographic calculation. So this is how they actually reason. There's actually a guy called, I think, Wenzler, who wrote a dissident opinion, who said, no, your calculations are mistaken. Actually, we need to eliminate 51 million, not 35. But they were arguing about numbers. It's just categories. And the Soviets function in the same way. It's categories. First it's the kulaks, then it's the Ukrainians, then it's the right-wing deviationists, the left-wing deviationists, and so forth and so forth and so forth. Then we get to the ethnic cleansings during World War II, the Chechens, the Cherkess, and so forth, the Kalmuks, the Tatars. It's always categories. And you don't necessarily have to kill a category. It depends what the level of risk. My personal belief is that the only reason they were so obsessed with killing the Jews is because that's what the boss wanted. And since the boss wants it, okay, then we have to do it. But there were lots of arguments within the bureaucracy. Obviously, Speer wanted to put the Jews to work, so he was resisting killing them. He wanted them as a labor force. If you look at what the negotiations inside the system, it's a very great counterexample is the negotiations about the Romi, the gypsy people. Himmler was personally obsessed with exterminating the Romi. He really wanted to kill them all. That was his idea. But other parts of the bureaucracy were completely unconvinced that this was necessary. And since Hitler didn't care, they just argued it out among themselves. And so there's sporadic intervention. Some groups get wiped out, some groups get deported, some groups get temporarily deported and then wiped out. It's completely random in terms of the internal negotiations within the bureaucracy but there's no plan. There's no North Pole like there is for the Jews. The only reason the Jews became such a North Pole for the entire bureaucracy is because that's what the boss wanted. And therefore the whole bureaucracy was structured in such a way that, as Kershaw writes, it had to work towards the will of the Fuhrer. That was the objective. If the boss didn't care, everybody just argued it out.
I haven't read enough of the novel to know how far your central protagonist, Maximilian, is ideological, because there's this big question about the perpetrators that goes back to Goldhagen versus Browning. Were there deep-rooted feelings of anti-Semitism that extended through the German population, which is Goldhagen's contention, or was Browning right that the perpetrators are actually not that ideological and have to drink a hell of a lot of schnapps to kill all the women and children that they kill? This is the classic Reserve Police Battalion 101 debate. So is Maximilian ideological, or is he just...
First of all, speaking from my personal experience, I think Goldhagen is full of shit, and Browning is completely right. This I'm 100% convinced of. It's just the way it works. I mean...
Yeah, I would agree.
It's a no-brainer, as they say. I mean, Goldhagen is an ideological writer, and he's just got it wrong. My character is a bit specific. He's an intellectual, he's an idealist, he's actually a utopist who actually really believes in the positive aspects of the Nazi project, which everybody forgets. There actually was a whole, just like communism, it was a utopia. Nazi means National Socialist. It's also, in a way, a communist project, although a national one. It's communism in one country, socialism in one country. A lot of these lawyer, intellectual, I mean, it's the whole Werner Best group, the Ollendorf group, I mean, these guys who all end up in the Gestapo and all ended up committing atrocious crimes, started out as real idealists. They really believed in a very positive way, and then they got sucked into it, and of course they couldn't go out. So my character, that was just a personal decision for this narrative, is like once he's in it for the run. He doesn't agree with most of what's going on. In the second half of the book, he's actually close to Speer and is trying to fight for keeping Jews alive as long as they can work. But for him, I reasoned about anti-Semitism. I've also studied a lot of medieval history. And the way I thought about anti-Semitism was exactly the way you think about Christianity in the Middle Ages. It's just the common level of discourse. That's the sort of the basis of discourse, is the Weltanschauung. You don't even talk about it. And within that, everything is possible, because it's just obvious, like the ground, like the air, you know.
I mean, I tend to think that once you have a system, once you're able to discount a part of your citizenry as not citizens, I mean, for whatever reason, whether because they're Jews or because they're enemies of the people, or because they're gypsies, or whatever reason, you know, then, and you're able to disqualify them and not treat them as human and not give them, you know, rights, then almost anything can happen to them. I mean, this is actually the argument of Tim Snyder's book, not Bloodlands, but Black Earth, which is a very interesting argument about why, that actually one of the things that saved people during the war was the existence of a state or the existence of bureaucracy. And when you had multiple invasions and governments wiped out, and you know, people lost their citizenship and they didn't belong anywhere, and no one had to worry about them, this is when they were wiped out. When people don't count.
So I have one last question before I think we should maybe take a couple from the floor, and then I know you have to go. Surely the most striking difference between the two stories is that the intellectuals of Imperial Russia had been largely destroyed in successive waves, so that by 1930s, the Soviet Union is really does not run on the basis of an intelligentsia. The intelligentsia has largely been destroyed.
But there's a new intelligentsia.
Right, but it's...
Which is a technical one.
Right,
it's a technical intelligentsia, which is quite different.
But the contrast with the Nazi story is very striking, because there were few institutions more committed and earlier committed to National Socialism than the German universities. And in the Nazi case, it's in fact highly educated people who make the running, and you've alluded to some of them in your remarks. Hitler's, of course, not a highly educated individual. He's a sort of, his ideas are a smorgasbord of ideas lifted from rather amateurish reading. But the people who work towards the Führer, who ultimately design the gas ovens and make Auschwitz possible, or theorize about how you can reconstruct the whole Eurasian landmass, have doctorates.
Why do you think the Stalinists didn't have doctorates? I mean, they were excellent engineers, and there were brilliant bureaucrats, and even the Bolsheviks had spent all those decades when they were sitting in Tsarist prison camps or in coffee shops in Vienna. They were reading and arguing and thinking. I mean, they count as intellectuals. I mean, they're just they're a particular breed of intellectual.
I don't know.
And also, Neil, it's difficult to make a valid comparison on this specific point simply because the people you're alluding to were actually physically wiped out in Russia, and therefore it's hard to say what role they could have played within the system if they'd been allowed to play a role within the system. They just weren't.
The reason I ask this question is simply that it is a troubling reality that all intellectuals have to grapple with, particularly when they're singing the praises of education as a prophylactic against wickedness, that education was at a very high level in Germany at the end of the 1920s. The German universities were generally regarded as the best in the world, which the Russian ones definitely weren't at that point. And yet, the most sophisticated, industrialized genocide emanates from this highly advanced society, and really that seems to me the central problem that hasn't properly been resolved in all the academic historical literature. How could that be?
I once had a discussion with a district commissioner in South Sudan in a place called, it wasn't Kodok, it was Canal. The guy had been educated in Stanford. He was a PhD. No, a master's, sorry. He was master's from Stanford. He'd worked for 8 years for UNDP. So for a South Sudanese, he was an incredibly highly educated guy. And he spoke perfect English. He'd lived for many years in America, and he'd come back with the whole independence thing to serve his country, blah, blah, blah. And he was a Dinka from a sub-clan from that area. And we're having this conversation about the problems. This is sort of the build-up to the Civil War of 2013, which I, like a bit earlier, but when it was sort of already brewing. And he started explaining to me, yeah, this is going to be a wonderful country. It's going to be beautiful. We just have one problem, it's the Nuer. And the Nuer are going to have to go. And I'm like, but they're not just going to go. I mean, what do you mean they're going to go? And he looked at me, he said, we're not stupid. I mean, we're not going to do the same mistakes as Rwanda, of course. This is 2011, so many years after Rwandan genocide. Of course we're not going to do the same thing in Rwanda. But I assure you, they're going to leave. And then it'll be a beautiful country once they're gone. And I was just looking at this guy going, are you just laying down a program for genocide in front of me? And the guy actually leaned over and said, have you written down everything I said? And I like, yeah, I did actually. And, education doesn't mean anything in terms
Neil,
of these processes.
I'm perplexed as to why you would think that education is the preventative against genocide. I mean, why does education by itself, I mean, the acquisition of knowledge, I mean, without some kind of morality, without some idea of human rights, is of course can lead in all kinds of directions. I mean, the Bolshevik, the 1920s in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine actually, as well as Russia, was an era of people were fanatically educating themselves. They were getting degrees. They were all kinds of, and remember, it was also a very optimistic moment for a lot of people. They were moving up the social scale. They were, they came from the countryside into the cities to study. And people were obsessed with education and remained so all the way through, right until they started drinking too much in the 1970s.
Well, I hesitate to go any further with this train of thought while time is so short. Perhaps we could take a couple of questions before we call it a night. There's a hand that's gone up right there. Do we have any roving microphones? Leo, can you get a microphone? Well, I think the microphone will help the people behind you at least, if you can just hang on.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your books.
Hold it up a bit higher.
Yeah, for all three of the books, because I feel a little bit like a fox in a zoo, because, my family is from the Pale of Settlement. Half of that was killed by the Nazis, and the other half was killed by by the communists, and that half participated in the revolution with all their might. But the question I have is actually to all three of you. We all know the Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil expression. But if we look at your books, in yours, Gulag, especially the Iron Curtain, there is no banality of evil. No. Every perpetrator there has nothing to do with banality. When we look at your empire, I understand that there were some pages in the imperial history which you describe in your book, and there is nothing to do with the banality of evil. And especially if we turn to Maximilian Auer, he's not banal at all. There is no banality at all, be it in the first half or when he's going to Stalingrad or at the very end. So can you explain me how this discourse of the evil and terror moved from banality of evil to where we are now, when we are starting to discuss how evil is not a banality in all three examples that you represent here?
Who would like to go first on Arendt?
So I think Hannah Arendt was one of the great geniuses of the 20th century, but I don't think there's ever anything banal about evil. I mean, I think famously she was even wrong about Eichmann, whom she saw as a kind of bureaucrat, but was in fact a fanatic. And anyway, it's an odd expression. I mean, there are people, there are different kinds of evil, right? There are people who invent the genocide. There are people who go along with it because they're scared not to. There are people who go along with it because they come to believe in it. There are people who go along with it because they're too lazy not to. There is many motives for being, many reasons and many kind of psychological explanations for being a perpetrator as there are types of human personality. I mean, there are all kinds of people involved. So I think that was just an unfortunate, one of her few mistakes.
No, I think it's just a misunderstanding of what she meant. I mean, she was trying to get past a model which existed at the time she was writing in the 60s of, it's what I was referring to earlier, the Visconti model, the sort of the drooling demons, the sort of Iago model, the very ancient model in Western society of the demon as someone exceptional, which, Hitler, one could argue, was indeed a very peculiar person. Maybe Stalin was a very peculiar person. And she was trying to say these particular people get nowhere if they don't have an entire apparatus and a system of completely normal people behind them. So what the word she should have used is normality more than banality, because normality is banal. I think that's what she was trying to get at. Within bureaucracies, within governments, within enterprises, companies, within any field of activity, you obviously have more energetic, dynamic, motivated people than others. Eichmann was one of those incredibly talented middle managers. I mean, that's what he was. And he was super committed to the cause. But if he'd been a middle manager at Apple or in Victor Pinch's company, he would have done the same thing for whatever the goals of that company were. He had absolutely no initiative in terms of what the objectives were. He just wanted to be the best at fulfilling those objectives that were set for him. And for that, he was incredibly dynamic. But that's also incredibly banal. There's a lot of people like that. And I think that's what Hannah Arendt was trying to get at, that these people do not think, they do not reason, they do not ask themselves, why am I doing what I'm doing? They're just part of a collective, and that's the objective of the collective, and then either you're just a lazy bastard and you just go with it, or you're a dynamic bastard and you try to be one of the best and rise and are very ambitious. But you don't set the objectives, you follow them. I think that's what she was, maybe didn't formulate it in the best possible way. I also agree with you, she's one of the great analysts of this century. But I think she figured something out with Eichmann, which she didn't formulate quite in the precise way and led to a lot of misunderstandings, but she was actually right about what he fundamentally was. Bureaucrats can be, I mean, look at Rumsfeld, a guy like Rumsfeld, for example. Rumsfeld is a bureaucrat to the bone, to the tip of his toes. And this guy started a war for nothing himself with Cheney, with two other guys. But he's still just nothing but a fucking bureaucrat. That's what he is. And that's the kind of guys who were around Hitler in the Nazi apparatus, people who think they have an idea and who are really, really, really good at executing it.
I'm
But
sure you
it's
weren't
still
intending
kinda
to
normal.
compare Don Rumsfeld to Adolf Eichmann, but hoping
But
that doesn't
actually
make it
he
to
did.
social media
In terms of
tonight.
the final results, okay, it's not quite the same thing, but the current mess we're in owes a lot to that gentleman.
I'm still too much of a uniqueness of the Holocaust guy to go along with that kind of analogy. But let me take one more question. Zachary Carabel's at the back and is showing interest in a microphone. Can we get one to him, Leah?
And it's just an interest in the microphone, not actually in the panel or the question. So look, obviously human beings are and should be fascinated by the roots of evil and what produces it. You know, we just saw Robin Wright. One of the most popular shows on Netflix now is called Mindhunter, about trying to figure out the roots of serial killers and all of it. But for all of you, and you just alluded to it, Neil, when looking at the past to try to understand, and even the more recent present with South Sudan, where do you and how do you draw the line between what's possible? All these things show what is at the worst of humanity possible, and what is probable, right? And there's always that tension of the awareness of what happened in the past, or the awareness of what we are all internally capable of, you know, and that's why human beings are fascinated by killers, versus whether or not those circumstances are probable in the present. And I'm just wondering for each of you how you kind of grapple with that. Neil, you said there's a uniqueness to it, which would suggest that, you know, what's possible may not be replicable. But I do think that's important when, in a contemporary world, there's a lot of looking at the past, particularly the 20th century past, as a potential roadmap for the future, and whether or not, you know, that is overdoing what is possible by conflating it with what is probable.
Well, I think that's perhaps a good point on which to end the discussion, because there's been a great deal of, in my view, somewhat casual writing recently about parallels between our own time and the 1930s. I wish I had a Bitcoin for every article along those lines I've had to read in the last 3 years, and I certainly think it's a very poor historical analogy for what is going on, and it leads to all kinds of, I think, rather febrile inferences about where we might go. But rather than answer your question myself, I'll let the panelists have a go. Yeah, obviously we now know that genocide involving millions of people is possible, even in an advanced society. But is it probable, Anne, that something like that could happen again?
I mean, yes, it's probable, and you know, if you look around the world, it is happening in various places. You know, the genocide of the Rohingya is taking place as we speak in Burma. You know, North Korea runs concentration camps, which, from everything I know about them, are exact replicas of Stalinist camps. There's not much difference even in the way they're organized and structured. Actually, Saddam Hussein's his filing system when he was running Iraq was exactly the same when and the way in which they kept track of people and the way the Secret Service worked was exactly the same as the one that had been used in the Soviet Union, because he borrowed it wholesale right up to the way the archives were organized. I know somebody who's worked it. So yes, of course these things are happening and they will happen. And it's important to understand that human nature has that possibility, and that's why we, you know, build liberal societies, and that's why we talk about human rights and so on. I mean, I agree with you completely about too many comparisons to the 1930s, and we live in a different era, and I think the threats are different, and I'm not that worried about the United States becoming Nazi Germany, you know, just yet. But, you know, I really think it's important for everybody who lives in particularly for those who live in democracies, because we can become apolitical and we can forget it. It's important for everybody to remember that the human brain, and particularly the collective human brain, has this potential, and it's a thing we do need to keep in mind, because it is always possible, and deterioration of society is always possible. It has happened many times in history.
Jonathan, a last word from you. You live in Europe. And have spent much of your life here. Could it happen again in Europe?
Look, I'm not going to venture predictions about Europe, and I do have a slight disagreement with you about the 30s current situation comparison. The one thing I'm fairly certain of is that the barriers to extreme violence are not individual. There's no such thing as individual morality, except in very few cases, that prevents people from perpetrating extreme violence. The barriers are social and collective. So what's incredibly important to prevent these levels of violence is the maintenance of these barriers that prevent us from perpetrating it. I mean, you mentioned a couple of cases, but look at bloody Rwanda. I mean, you talk about the exceptionality of the Holocaust. What's exceptional? What actually defines that exceptionality? Is it the fact that they're Jews? No, it's a category. Is it the fact that they were targeted for what they were? No, so were the Tutsis in Rwanda. Is it the method of killing? Okay, that's pretty unique, the industrial method of killing, but that's just a method. In Rwanda, they used machetes for the same objective. And actually, if you look at the rate of success, the Nazis in 4 years managed to kill less than 50% of European Jewry, whereas the Rwandans in 3 months with machetes managed to kill 30% of the Tutsis in Rwanda. So, you know, you have to put methods in front of the success rate to make any kind of meaningful comparison about what makes a genocide more exceptional than another genocide. A genocide is a genocide, it's a process. And it aims at eliminating categories, and it becomes possible when certain social barriers break down. It's what I was alluding to earlier when I was talking about the World War I origins of the World War II genocides. France and England, having won the war, kind of went to the brink of that logic and then backed off it. They're like, no, there's certain barriers we will not pass. It wasn't a question of democracy. They probably formulated in terms of common decency. I don't even know how they thought about themselves, but there were some things they wouldn't do. Whereas the Germans, there's something that really struck me in the reading of the German literature of the time, of the 20s. It's an argument that comes back all the time, all the time, all the time. We have sacrificed the best of our blood, the best of our generation, the smartest, the brightest have all gone to their death for our nation. If we can sacrifice the best, why can't we get rid of the worst? That's a constant theme. It comes back all the time, and that's the groundwork for what happens in the 30s. And that participates in this mechanism of breaking down these barriers, these, you know, whatever we call them. And what worries me a lot about what's going on now with what's going on in England, what's going on in America, is that you see a similar process of breaking down barriers. Things that we kind of held, I wouldn't call them sacred because that's too glorious a word, but at least massively important, are now being destroyed systematically and deliberately by one side of the political debate. And the other side of the political debate, in America it's Democrats and Republicans, in England it's slightly different, is trying to uphold these barriers, saying, no, actually, guys, the destruction of the barriers is more important than you guys winning or are we winning. That argument's not working anymore. And what I fear very much now is that having broken down these barriers, they're never going to come back, or at least not in our predictable, very close future. And there's a kind of snowball effect, which you see, I mean, I've seen it at work in many wars. For instance, I worked in Syria at the beginning of the conflict, 2012, and I'll just give a last little example to show you what I'm talking about. So I went clandestinely into homes through Lebanon, blah, 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 with these very, very idealistic young revolutionaries. They were guys who believed in rule of law, in a civil society, they were completely anti any kind of ethnic or religious identity. They were real militants. I mean, tough young guys who were getting killed one after the other, but they weren't scared. They were just doing it for the cause. And it happens that I got along with one kid more than other kids. This happens. A guy who called himself Abu Bilal. We just had this nice, warm relationship. So when I left for a couple of years, I kept kind of track of him. 2 years later, after the siege of Homs, he had gone completely ISIS. When they evacuated from Homs, he became the head of propaganda of ISIS for Idlib. Same kid. And another year later, he went and blew himself up in his home neighborhood, 3 blocks from his mother's house, killing 40 of his former neighbors who were Alawis. So you just see these curves happening. I mean, once things break, they don't get fixed. People have been alluding to this all day today. It's like it's very easy to break shit. It's not easy to fix it. And it's you know, today is dangerous times in a obviously completely different way in the 30s, but what you see in the 30s, that same discourse in France also. I mean, you know, with the right wing in France and just the sort of breaking down of the norms of discourse, the insults of opponents, the aggressivity, that to me feels very familiar today.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, and of course, as the moderator, I get to have the last word, and so I'll conclude by observing that we haven't really touched on the case of China, but my colleague at the Hoover Institution, Frank de Kuyter, has written 3 searing books about the Maoist experience that make it clear that it bears comparison in almost every respect with the experience of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union. And of course, it's a tricky one to fit into your model, since China was nominally one of the victors of World War II and yet unleashed this comparable terror.
It's not a question of winning or losing, it's a question of the damage to society. And Chinese society had been laminated by the Japanese by the time the Communist Revolution came around. So actually it does kind of...
So we have a fantastic contrast in methods here between the historian and the novelist. I think it's clear that Jonathan has a remarkable capacity to get inside the head even of an SS officer of a different nationality and different generation. We historians are forced to be rather more pedestrian and ask if really the 1930s is always the right analogy, when populism in the late 19th century looks a lot more like the populism of our own time. In the end, the thing that makes, in my view, the Nazi experience unique is that almost all the other genocides happened in relatively backward places, economically backward places. The fact is that the Holocaust emanated from one of the most advanced industrial societies on Earth. Really, only the United States was in the same ballpark in terms of economic and other development. And that's what makes it different from all the other cases that we've touched on tonight. And I still don't quite know how I can reconcile in my own mind all that had been achieved by German Kultur, not to mention by the German Wirtschaft, with what unfolded, which does indeed bear comparison with many of the cases that you've alluded to, but all those other cases are, by the standards of an economic historian, things that happened in relatively backward places. We must stop there, especially as I promised Jonathan to get him out of here 10 or 15 minutes ago. I'd like to invite you all to join me in thanking our 2 brilliant speakers.